Casualties from HMS Sheffield arrive on another task force ship, the painful reality of the Falklands War. Tonight, with little hope of a peaceful settlement in prospect, British troops are poised to attack Port Stanley. In this programme, we look at the background issues which are sometimes obscured by the action on the front line. Our forces in the South Atlantic have won widespread public praise. But how generous will we be with our support when the story is off the front pages? Could a nation that can afford to defend principle at such cost also afford to give a better deal to those injured in active service and to the families of our war dead? As the fighting goes on, the casualty lists will get longer. And there is another price to be paid, of course. Today, what decides whether ships sink or survive is how many tens of millions of pounds are spent on anti-missile systems and effective air support. Now, uppermost tonight is the hope for a quick end to the siege of Port Stanley. But what happens after we push the Argentinians off the islands? How many aircraft, ships and men can we afford to keep there to guard against another invasion? Because the truth is that a lot of the discussions going on in Whitehall today must be about money. Tonight, we look at the kind of costs that are being calculated. To give us some indication of costs, I have with me Mr. David Greenwood, Director of the Centre for Defence Studies at Aberdeen University. Now, Mr. Greenwood is regularly consulted about defence matters by the Ministry of Defence. He has also been called before the House of Commons Defence Committee to give evidence as an independent expert.
In any assessment of the financial implications of the crisis, the first item being talked about must inevitably be the cost of dispatching the original task force and its reinforcements, 27,000 men and 100 ships sent to the South Atlantic on a war footing, the fuel and ammunition they use up during operations, and the long train of tankers and transport vessels that back them up.
David Greenwood, can you give a basic figure for the cost of the task force?
Well, there's no official estimate. The government hasn't issued one. But I calculate that the operation thus far has probably led to the government spending, or at least incurring obligations, to the tune of about £500 million.
Well, sums of that size bewilder most of us. Can you give some examples that show how big it is or perhaps how small it is?
Well, £500 million represents £300,000 for every Falklander. That way it sounds like a lot of money. But another way of looking at it would be to say it's £10 for every man, woman and child in the United Kingdom. That way it doesn't sound so much.
So there are obviously two ways of looking at it.
Indeed.
Well, in reckoning the cost, we must also count in the destruction of many expensive fighting machines. Sea King helicopters involved in round-the-clock flying cost about £3 million each to replace. So far, 5 have been lost. Harriers, our staple fighter-bomber aircraft, cost about £7.5 million each. Up until the weekend, we had lost 8 of these, and each week the figure goes up. Class 21 frigates like HMS Antelope cost about £100 million to replace. 2 of these have been sunk. And the larger HMS Coventry and HMS Sheffield would cost £125 million each if they had to be replaced at present prices. The task force has sustained other heavy losses. David Greenwood, what do you make now the total of all the material losses?
Well, this is not money spent. It's on a slightly different basis from that earlier figure we were talking about. It's a notional value for assets that have in fact been written off. But on that basis, I think replacement values would put the bill at another £500 million.
Now, can you give me an idea of what that would be as a proportion of, say, the annual defence budget?
Well, £1,000 million out of the 1982-83 defence budget of 14,000 millions, 1/14 or 7%.
Now, what would that £1,000 million buy if you were spending it, say, in the public sector?
A point of reference in terms of civil expenditure. Well, it represents something like 3 times the British contribution to the European Community budget, for example, which there was a lot of fuss about the other week. It's almost exactly equal to the money the government set aside for lending to the nationalised industries. That's to cover the losses of British Airways, British Rail, British Leyland, and so on.
Right. So, however you make those comparisons, it might seem a heavy burden for our weak economy to bear. Money lost in war that might have been better spent rebuilding Britain. But the war has already brought benefit to some who needed it. This is Newcastle on Tyne, a badly depressed area. Unemployment here now runs at 20%. People in Tyneside know how it feels to be out of work.
George Douglas, a painter, has known long periods of unemployment. Roy Dalglish was out of work for 6 months, supporting a wife and child on £50 a week. Peter Rosamond, a labourer with 2 children, got £36 a week. But since the crisis, things are looking up. An aircraft carrier, HMS Illustrious, has recently been built here. She's the sister ship of Invincible, now with a task force. Illustrious was being fitted out at a leisurely pace, but now it's a rush job, and 300 extra labourers have been taken on. The 3 men we have seen suddenly found themselves in work.
I was told the contractor was looking for so many men for Swan Hunters. I think it was the Illustrious. I phoned the contractor up, got the job.
And he told me to start up at the Walker Naval Yard the following morning.
How did you feel about taking this particular job?
Well, happy that I got a job, but sad for the reason it was for the war.
But you still took it?
Well, I had to.
Why?
I do. Well, when you're a contractor, you've got to take anything that comes along. Money-wise, I mean, £36 no good to anybody, is it? Not to me, anyway.
How much are you earning now?
Well, if I put a full week in, £140 to come out with. That's 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts.
Some of those working on Illustrious wonder why public money hasn't been available earlier to create jobs in depressed areas.
Like, where does the government get the money from, to start with? I mean, they're cutting back on this, that and the other, hospitals and schools, etc. And then all of a sudden they can come up with they can get a flood of men onto a ship to get it done, to get it rushed off to the Falklands.
Well, David Greenwood, you heard the complaint there. How can money be found for a war when it doesn't seem to exist for social problems?
Well, it's a matter of priorities. Government has decided that it wants to cut public expenditure generally, including a lot of those social programmes, but in this instance it's said it will ascribe an overriding priority to the restoration of British administration in the Falklands. Therefore, it's prepared to see the Ministry of Defence, I guess, overspend, if necessary, this year and dip into the Treasury's contingency fund.
What's the contingency fund? What's that used for?
Well, each year the Treasury adds up the sum of the bids from major spending departments, and reckoning that there may be some unforeseen developments, it sets aside a certain amount of money for... It's a rainy day fund for the government.
So it's an accountant's device for anything unexpected.
Indeed it is.
What about those men there on Tyneside? They're obviously in work for how long one doesn't know, but if £1,000 million worth of material has been lost, does that mean that jobs will be created in replacing that £1,000 million worth?
Well, that £1,000 million we were talking about consists of 2 bits. £500 million of money actually spent. That has been creating jobs, including the ones the gentlemen on the film were talking about. The other £500 million represents losses. If government elects to make good those losses, to build new ships, to build additional aircraft and so on, then that too will generate more jobs as time goes by.
Right. Well, we now look at another area where war and money meet. The world's arms buyers are watching the Falklands War with great interest, and Washington is paying particularly close attention to the British Harrier jump jet. Bert Cooper advises the United States Congress on whether to buy Harriers. At this level, the stakes are high.
The Harrier is an aircraft that the U.S. Marine Corps has been using now for over 10 years. And more importantly, the Marines expect to buy a considerable number of a full or an advanced version of this aircraft, the AV-8B, involving some $10 billion. So we're looking at it very closely.
they have been taking a special effort to monitor its performance.
Absolutely, quite so.
What's your assessment of how well the Harrier has performed?
Well, it's done quite well, extremely well, in fact, and much better than many people thought. The aircraft has been controversial. There was some concern about survivability. How will it do in combat? How will it do as a fighter, air combat? As we sit here now, having seen its operation in May, we can say that it's done very well in that it has taken down apparently 20-some Argentine aircraft. So this includes the supersonic Mirage, the A4 Skyhawk, and these are very good planes. They're fighters.
America's planning to buy 340 of the new advanced Harrier. What influence do you think the plane's performance in the Falklands will have on those plans?
Well, it has firmed it up, I would say. And there's always a fight in Congress and within the government. Again, limited resources. And so that had the Harrier done very badly in the Falklands, this would have been quite damaging. Might well have cancelled the program.
But as seen from Washington, the Falklands crisis has not helped some other British arms exports.
The Latin American market would be effectively closed, first of all. But the Exocet has so completely dominated the scene that, frankly, no one sees anything but the smoke rising from the Sheffield. This has completely obscured any other lessons at present.
In what way?
Well, everyone wants to buy an Exocet. If you're a third world country about to grab a colony or realize your national destiny, you will get an Exocet. If you've got something you don't want grabbed, you will try to defend against the Exocet. So this is where the action is around that. The other, and Exocet is not a British product, it's French.
But
so this rather obscured the British marketing situation.
The whole area of naval protection against guided missiles presents big sales opportunities. British arms and missiles expert Bill Gunston explains.
Nobody likes war, nobody really likes arms sales, unless you happen to be an arms salesman. But we've had so few real wars, and no wars previously that involved such use of guided weapons, that the whole world is eagerly watching to see how these weapons perform.
In selling her missiles, Britain faces stiff competition from foreign rivals with proven records.
Well, obviously one has to mention the French Exocet, which has got a lot of mileage out of its successes against two of our warships. But apart from that, the missiles which have shone, I think, are the American Sidewinder, even in its early version. It's, again, proven to be quite an effective weapon.
First reports on the prospects of some British missiles are not encouraging.
I do get the impression that some of our weapons have been fairly ineffectual.
Which ones?
Our ships, I think, have generally been reckoned to be underarmed. The Type 21 frigates, in fact, all our surface warships, they're extremely costly, and they are grossly underarmed, especially in rapid-fire weapons for use against aircraft at close range. For example, the Sheffield and Coventry have the Sea Dart missile, which can intercept an aircraft at a range of the order of tens of miles. But you can only knock down two, because you've only got the two Sea Darts. Then you have to reload the launcher, and while that's happening, the other aircraft come in and perhaps sink you, and this is exactly what happened with Coventry.
Other products have proved in action their worth and salability.
Particularly the Seawolf ship-to-air missile.
That's the British one?
Yes, it is. It's only used in 2 of the ships which we have with the task force. But because you can fire off 12 of them in rapid succession, and because they can be used at close range against anything, even including a sea-skimming missile, it's proved to be what everybody thought it would be, the most effective of all the ship-to-air missiles. Various people in the know realise that at least one Seawolf actually intercepted a shell from a gun. Now, this is something which no missile had ever done before, and so far as I know, has never happened since.
What capacity, what potential is there for overseas sales of the Seawolf as a result of the Falklands?
Very large indeed.
The tough world of the international arms salesman. But another cost of any war is that of the long-term care for the wounded and for the families of the dead. About 125 British servicemen are said to have died so far. plus another 4 in a helicopter crash announced this evening. Government provision for widows is adequate but hardly generous. The widow of an army private or ordinary seaman killed in the Falklands will get a lump sum of £7,400 and £81 a week pension. But these figures reflect recent rises in pensions paid to the widows of soldiers killed in Northern Ireland. The widow of a private killed in World War II gets only £35.40 a week. And a childless widow under 40, whose husband died before the Ulster Troubles, gets £8.15 a week. The war wounded are not treated too generously either. Thousands of World War II veterans live on under £60 a week. That's below the TUC poverty line. And there are other kinds of cost.
We visited the Star and Garter home in London, which provides excellent care for ex-servicemen. Conversations with residents emphasised that the effects of a serious injury can last a lifetime. Former Private Herbert Hedgecock.
I was injured on the Somme, 1st of July 1916, by a dum-dum bullet. That means to say that when they strike you, they explode, and it blew half my, well, the whole of my arm off, plus a part of the shoulder.
Former Lance Corporal Charles Hankins looks back in a few decisive seconds in the North African desert during World War II. A mortar bomb fell close by him and shrapnel tore into him.
And I was laying like this, and I felt both my legs go in the air, and I looked round, and this one was blown clean off through here, and this one was hanging off.
Mr. Hankins now works as a toolmaker at the home.
Was it very hard to adapt to having to live like that?
Well, it was fairly difficult at first, but you've got to change your life, I think. Forget the past and start again.
Alongside the veterans of 2 world wars are the young men injured in Northern Ireland. Colin Wooten was shot in the head in Belfast when he was 18. Now 28, he's crippled and cannot talk. No amount of money could compensate for his injuries. He will spend the rest of his life in this home. Since the First World War, many former servicemen have had 2 continuing complaints. War injury pensions, they claim, are too low, small reward for men hailed at the time as heroes. And sometimes, they say, they have to fight to get even the minimum they're entitled to. The Ministry of Defence often insists on strict proof that disabilities were caused by injuries in active service. For Bill Shaw, who lives in Manchester, even getting to the front door to greet visitors is hard work because of an active service injury. The government now accepts that cancer which caused his leg and hip to be removed originated with a wound he got fighting in Ulster. But for 2 years, the ministry refused to accept that this was so. His application for a pension was turned down. Bill Shaw had to go through examinations, appeals, counter-appeals and a formal hearing to win.
On the day of the tribunal, when I went to Manchester to in front of the committee that was sat in front of me, I mean, it's a traumatic experience to go in front of people to prove that you lost your limb due to army services in Northern Ireland.
Assisting his case was Bill Edwards, local secretary of Blesma, the British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association, a pressure group that argues for more compassionate and generous treatment for the war wounded.
There's this constant having to appeal and appeal again. And what we say in Blesma, well, I've said it for long enough, we shouldn't have to do this sort of thing. Men have paid the price not only of losing a leg or an arm, they pay the price in the currency of pain. And people, the ministry just don't seem to accept or understand that.
Well, the pain is unbelievable. I mean, I don't think you'd experience it unless you've lost a limb. And I have what they call phantom pains. And it's like hot pins and needles. And it's like sweat running down your leg. I mean, I can put my hand out and go like that and touch my toes. I mean, which is unbelievable on the left side of your leg, and it's frightening.
The other night, I was in a public house, and they were shouting and bawling about the invasion and what they ought to do and what they ought not to and all this sort of thing. And I just happened to say, I said, well, look, lads, I only hope that when all those that's on the back benches that's thrown their order papers in the air and cheered, and when all the newspapers have finished printing all the marvellous, wonderful things they've said about lads running up the beaches and all this sort of honour and all this sort of thing, I can only, and the general public for that matter, I can only hope that when it's all over, those same backbenchers, those same newspapers, those same people from the general public will shout and holler as loud as what they did then when we in Blesmer say, look, there's a lad here who's not getting a proper pension.
What do you think when you watch on television the wounded coming back from the Falklands?
I look at it this way. I was in the forces for 10.5 years. I had friends in the forces, in my particular regiment. I had lots of friends. And when you come to a disability, as we'll say I've got, or anybody coming back from the South Atlantic, they've still got their friends. But once they've been medically discharged from Her Majesty's forces, the friends have left them.
At the Star and Garter home, former Private Hedgecock gives his view of the latest war.
But what about the men who were wounded in the Falklands?
Well, I say good luck to them. I hope they're well looked after. That's what I say.
Do you think they will be?
Well, I sincerely hope so, because it must cost a hell of a lot of money, us as a nation, to be over there. Hell of a lot of money. But I hope they're well looked after. They should be. God bless them.
David Greenwood, to many people, the human cost like that is the most important of all. But how significant are things like war pensions in overall economic terms?
Well, can I say that I think pictures like that convey the real cost of war, any war. And I think Private Hedgecock is right. A great deal of money has been spent in mounting the Falklands operation. And in my judgment, for a fraction of that money, you could provide adequate pensions, decent care for the wounded and the disabled. I don't know what the fraction is exactly, but it's a few £1 million rather than several £100 million.
So very important, but also a very small cost overall.
In financial terms, yes.
Well, let me ask you finally, if we don't get a satisfactory settlement, what will it cost in future to defend, to hang on to the Falklands?
Or if the crisis, the immediate crisis, is resolved by the British repossession of the Falklands Islands by force, which now seems likely, then we'll be on terms of a certain animosity with the Argentinians for some time. That'll mean short-term or even medium-term provision for protecting the Falkland Islands. That's going to mean additional expenditure, quite apart from the things we've been talking about in the last half hour.
How many ships, how many planes, how many men?
I would think one would need a garrison of about a brigade strength to provide a deterrent presence, 3,000 men. A patrol of naval vessels, perhaps 2 or 3 warships, 1 or 2 submarines, and a modest air defence presence of some sort. And that would mean higher defence expenditures above present plans to the tune of something like £200 million next year, perhaps rising to £500 million by the mid-1980s.
Would the taxes have to go up to pay for that?
My judgment is that the Prime Minister was probably contemplating reductions in taxation for us in 1983, ahead of the general election, which has to come very soon after that.
David Greenwood, thank you. So, tonight, we appear to be in sight of a famous victory, the cost of which is heavy, but not crippling. The £1,000 million already spent might have gone to build houses and hospitals, but equally it might have gone on pay claims, on subsidies to European farmers. It certainly won't do more than dent the budget of a government which commits more than 100 times as much each year to public spending. The long-term costs are more difficult to calculate. What will it cost us in lost trade with Latin America? Or more important, what will it cost to keep on defending the Falklands year after year against an embittered enemy? If Argentina is prepared to pay the price in lives, how long can we afford to defend? The armed forces are doing their job in winning the war. Now we must wait and see if the politicians can construct a lasting peace.